If you have a student with a learning disability or ADHD in your classroom, it's likely that you have seen the accommodation for chunking on their IEP. Today, I'm going to talk about what is chunking and why it's important for learning. Chunking is the perfect example of a strategy that is necessary for some students but will be helpful for all of your students. In my own teaching practice, I very rarely go to any extra trouble to chunk assignments for students because it's just become something that I do as part of my day-to-day practice. Chunking takes a really big learning task or blocks of new information and breaks it down into bite-sized chunks. To know why chunking is necessary, you have to know how the working memory works. Learning science is very new and still in development, but based on what we know right now, the memory is usually broken down or simplified into two different areas: working memory or short-term memory and long-term memory. The easiest way to think about this is like the RAM and the hard drive of your computer. The working memory, or the RAM, takes immediate pieces of information and processes them. Like you see a big furry blob with a tail and your working memory says dog. The long-term memory, or the hard drive, is where you store information to be retrieved later. Like, I've seen this dog 5 times, he belongs to my neighbor, the dog's name is Max. It's generally accepted that working memory is limited and long-term memory is infinite. Sounds good, right? Infinite memory. The problem is, for information to be sorted and stored into long-term memory, it has to go through a bottleneck, the bottleneck that is the working memory. How much information can actually be stored in the working memory is a question that scientists continue to ask, but the accepted total is somewhere between 4 and 7 distinct elements. This is where chunking becomes really important. One element is one chunk. One chunk can be one random number, or 3 really familiar numbers like 911, or a longer string of numbers that you've used a bunch of times, like your first phone number. Once a group of information has been automatized, like you've used it so many times that your working memory pulls it from your long-term memory as one chunk, then it stops taking up a ton of space in your working memory and leaves space for new information. To understand why this is important for teachers, I'm going to use an example that I see all the time in my work in special education: trigonometry. I usually start any intervention with a student with a joke or a funny picture because your memory is also very closely tied to your emotions, and you tend to remember the nicest things and the worst things that happen to you. Then I try to figure out which parts of the process the student already knows how to do. Trigonometry has lots of steps, and each of those steps has to be learned, practiced, and then consolidated into one chunk. Otherwise, what you're asking a student to do is to complete a problem that has 7 steps, but their working memory may be filled to the brim with: what does 90 degrees look like? What is a right angle? What are those names again? What is hypotenuse anyway? If they're a student with ADHD, they are probably also carrying around: what's that noise in the corner? Why is the light buzzing? I wonder what we're having for dinner. Ideally, we'd go back and practice and consolidate all of the steps in order. That would be the best way, but it's not practical in a day-to-day classroom situation. Another simple solution is an anchor chart. I've made some version of a chart like this probably 50 times. I've written it on chart paper, on scraps of paper, on whiteboards, and sometimes just on the back of someone's hand. Kids will use the chart, or sometimes just pieces of the chart, as one chunk, and then over time they'll stop referring to the chart as that chunk becomes consolidated and moves into long-term memory. The important thing for you, the teacher, to remember is that many of the chunks that you've stored away in your long-term memory. This is information that you draw on easily because you've done it 100 times. Some of those chunks will require a large percentage, or maybe all, of a student's working memory. for them, your one chunk may represent 10 individual pieces of new information. Since the human capacity for new information probably maxes out at about 4, you may have just asked your student to process a quantity of information that's simply not biologically possible, and that may only be in the first step of the problem. I'm not saying any of this to discourage you. Human beings learn new information and it gets stored and sorted into long-term memory every single day. You have been through the process that your students are working through, and likely in a very similar way. Your job is to know what they know and then build from there, one step at a time. What's a new task that you tried to do that didn't come easily, that you had to break down and practice step by step? Tell me in the comments. There are also some citations below if you want to look more into the science, and also some extra suggestions.